Winter will decide which one of us is wasting time." Those words would cost Garrett Coe almost everything he owned, though it was the ragged drifter he'd mocked that morning who came back to save it, before spring ever found the Chiricahua Basin again. By the third night of the Whitehorn, Antelope Wash Ranch had disappeared. Wind ran past 65 miles an hour, and the cold had fallen to 33 below, and somewhere out past the barn, a section of woven willow had torn loose from its posts. Caleb had a rope tied around his waist. Etenia held the other end in both hands, braced against the doorframe with her boots dug into the packed snow. If the wall gave way, the wind would find the barn door and pack it shut before morning, and inside, a cow was fighting to deliver a calf that had turned the wrong way, while a boy counted marker posts through the whiteout and a baby cried behind a canvas curtain. 6 weeks before, this same man had walked onto her land with nothing but a plea for milk. Late in September of 1887, Caleb Whitfield came over the last rise above the Chiricahua Basin with a handcart, a coat patched in 2 different kinds of cloth, and 2 children who had stopped asking how much farther. He was 34, though the trail had put closer to 50 years into his face. 9-month-old Wren rode against his shoulder in a sling made from an old grain sack. 8-year-old Micah walked beside the cartwheel without complaint, matching his father's pace step for step, his shoes worn soft at the heel. Caleb had spent years fixing barns, pumps, freight wagons, and grain sheds along the rail supply stations further north. He knew how to read a leaking roof and a failing well the way other men read a newspaper. But after his wife Sarah died of a fever that took her 3 days after Wren was born, he could no longer travel with a repair crew and keep 2 small children fed at the same time. Every crew boss he asked gave the same answer, kind or not. A man with 2 babies and a handcart slowed a wagon train down, and nobody out on the supply road had time to slow down. So he had started walking south alone, looking for one ranch willing to trade shelter for skill, sleeping under the cart some nights when no barn would take them in. 3 ranches had already turned him away. The first had work for him, but none of it included a bed for 2 children. The second gave them one night in a hayloft and pointed them back to the road by sunup. The third, not unkindly, suggested that a girl as small as Wren would do better with a family that already had a mother in the house. Caleb answered none of them back. He simply picked up the cart handles and kept walking, the wheels squeaking. The same complaint, mile after mile. On the last night before they reached Antelope Wash, Wren would settle for nothing but thin-grain porridge, and even that only after an hour of crying that left her voice raw. Caleb watched his son quietly break his piece of cornbread in half and tuck one part deep inside his coat, even after Caleb promised there would be food again tomorrow. He understood then what the boy actually believed. Tomorrow was not a thing Micah trusted in anymore. Then the ranch appeared past a wind-scoured rise, and Caleb stopped walking long enough to look at it properly. Antelope Wash sat low against a shoulder of red rock, the only green for miles, running along a slow creek that cut the basin in 2. The barn roof sagged in the middle. Its doors faced straight into the northwest wind. A row of willow trees stood too close to the building, and half of them looked dead already. Smoke poured sideways out of the chimney, but inside the corral, the milk cows were still on their feet, and that was worth more to Caleb than anything he'd seen at the last 3 ranches combined. A working ranch fed its stock before it fed its pride, and this one clearly had, even half broken. A woman stood at the stock trough breaking a skin of early ice with the back of a hammer, far too soon in the season for water to be freezing at all. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow. A feed ledger sat tucked under her belt, and one glove on her right hand had gone smooth and pale from years of holding reins. She watched the stranger and the 2 children come up the track, and she did not move to help them, and did not move to turn them away, either. She simply waited. then put one question to him. This was Etenia, a young Chiricahua Apache widow who had run Antelope Wash alone since the winter that took her husband, and nothing about the way she stood suggested a woman who needed rescuing by anyone. What kind of work do you know? Caleb didn't offer his story. Not yet. Barn frames, hand pumps, water troughs, wagon wheels, roofs, chinking, hay storage. And what do you need? His eyes went to Wren, who had stopped crying and was chewing the corner of her blanket instead, because hunger had worn out even her tears. Give my kids milk. Let us sleep somewhere out of the wind. I'll fix what winter is about to break on this place. Etenia looked past him toward the barn. What makes you think anything here is broken? Caleb lifted one hand toward the buildings. Your barn doors face straight into the northwest wind. Your hay's pulling damp up out of the ground underneath it. That water line's going to freeze solid before the first real cold front gets here. Silence stretched out between them. Confidence was easy to come by out here. Proof was not. Etenia looked at Micah, then at Wren, still resting against her father's shoulder, and she stepped forward without answering a word of what Caleb had claimed. She simply lifted the little girl out of his tired arms. The milk comes first. She was already turning for the house before he could argue it. Your claims can wait for morning. Inside she warmed fresh milk with a little water, tested it against the inside of her wrist, and nodded for Caleb to feed it to Wren slowly. Her stomach's been emptied too long to rush. A bowl of stew, cornbread, and dried apples went in front of Micah, and another waited for Caleb even after he quietly insisted he wasn't hungry. Micah ate without a word, and before he'd finished, he slid the last of his cornbread into his pocket the way he always did now. Etenia noticed and let it pass without comment. She only set another piece down beside his bowl, as if it had belonged there all along. Across the table, Caleb's hands shook too badly to keep the cup steady against Wren's mouth, and Etenia reached over and held the bottom of it without taking the baby from him. Between small bites, they traded only the facts that mattered. Sarah had died 6 months back from a childbed fever that came on fast. Talico, Etenia's husband and the man who had built most of what stood on this ranch, had been killed 3 winters earlier when a loaded wagon slid off an icy grade in the foothills. Etenia had never had children of her own. Antelope Wash was carrying debt it had no easy way to pay after losing 9 head of cattle in last year's cold. That evening she opened the door to the old foreman's room and carried down a cradle from the loft. One Talico had started building years ago and never finished. One rail still rough where it had never been sanded smooth. Caleb noticed she'd kept it all this time, instead of burning it for kindling on some hard night. He didn't ask why. He understood. That night Wren slept peacefully in the unfinished cradle for the first time in weeks. Micah fell asleep with his hand still curled tight around the bread hidden in his coat pocket. Before sunrise, Caleb was already walking the ranch, and he didn't pick up a single tool. He watched first. A strip of wool hung by the barn door showed him exactly how the wind curled through the opening every time it gusted. He dug a shovel into the ground beneath the haystack and found the bottom layer sitting in damp earth. He poured water into one end of the trough and timed how long it took to drain inside the house. A thin seam of frost had crept into the chinking between the logs. Outside, old ridges of packed snow still sat against the fence where last winter had piled them, and never fully melted. Etenia followed without a word, and when Caleb finally began to explain what he'd found, he pointed instead of waving his hands around. The barn's not losing heat because the walls are thin. It's losing heat because the wind walks straight through that door. He knelt by the haystack. This is spoiling from the bottom up. He nodded toward the pump. Your water line's too shallow. It's got nowhere to drain once you're done using it. His hand rested against the log wall of the house. This chinking's pulled loose from the wood. Last, he looked at the row of dying willow. Those trees stand too close. Last winter, the snow drifted right where you needed a clear doorway. Etenia folded her arms. Talico planted those willows. He wasn't wrong to. Caleb shook his head. They cut spring wind. Winter storms come from a different direction than spring ones do. The trees stayed the same. The weather didn't. Something eased in her face, just slightly. Her father had read Wind the Same Patient Way, she explained, watching how juniper bent low along a ridge before a storm ever showed itself in the sky. Long before he passed the habit down to Talico, long before Talico had ever tried to plant a windbreak of his own out here. Caleb looked out over the whole ranch one more time. 6 weeks, water first, hay second, then the windbreak. The offset entrance, fresh chinking, marker posts before the first real storm gets here. Etenia studied him a long moment before she pointed toward the tool shed. You get 1 week, then I'll decide whether you see problems or whether you invent them. Caleb only nodded and picked up the shovel. If a story like Etenia's is the kind that keeps you watching until the very end, become a channel member. Just tap join beside the channel name. It helps these frontier stories keep coming. Caleb started with the jobs least likely to start an argument. The hay came first. He, Etenia, and Micah pulled away the bottom layers of the stack together, and a sour, wet smell rose up where moisture had pooled against the ground. Caleb built a raised crib 8 inches off the dirt, using old pine rails already lying behind the shed, and instead of piling the hay back into one solid mound, he split it into smaller sections with narrow gaps of air running between them. Micah's job was simple. 8 inches, Caleb showed him with a piece of scrap wood, and the boy measured every gap himself and counted the spaces out loud, more words than he'd used since they'd arrived at the ranch. Next came the water line. Caleb opened a test trench and found the pipe buried just over 2 feet down. It needed to sit at 4'6" through here, with enough fall in the ground to empty itself out after every use. Etenia studied the trench. We don't have time to dig the whole line before the cold sets in. Then we don't dig the whole line. His answer stayed short. We protect the stretch between the well and the milk cows first, and worry about the rest come spring. Late that afternoon, Nettie Voss, an elderly widow from a neighboring spread, who kept a quiet watch over half the families in the basin, drove her cart up the track with fresh goat's milk and news nobody had gone looking for. She'd buried a husband of her own out past the second gate, years before Talico, and she'd made it her business ever since to know which ranches in the basin were struggling before their owners would admit it out loud. Garrett Coe had been asking around about Etenia's new man. Nobody answered that either. While she set 2 loaves of bread on the table, her eyes caught the bread Micah had tucked into his pocket, and she glanced toward Etenia. Should I leave just the 1 loaf? Etenia shook her head. Leave both. That evening, Caleb handed her a short list of supplies. Everything that could be reused had been crossed off first. Only what truly needed buying was left on the page. By the 3rd day, stakes marked the outline of Caleb's new windbreak across the open ground, 34 feet northwest of the barn, not pressed against it, not standing in front of the doors, but far enough out to break the wind's strength before it ever reached the buildings. The frame would run in an L shape, rising to 7 feet 6 inches at its tallest point. Lodgepole pine would carry the weight of it, and willow branches would be woven between the posts, loosely enough that the wall would never try to stop every gust outright. Sod and brush would anchor the base. The shorter arm would shelter the path running between the house and the barn. Micah hauled willow cuttings from the creek bank in armfuls nearly too big for him, stacking them by size the way Caleb showed him, while Etenia paced off the L shape twice more with her own stride to be sure the numbers matched the ground and not just the paper. Etenia added something of her own to the plan that Caleb hadn't thought to ask for. Her father had shown her, long before she married Talico, how the old camps banked snow into low walls on the north side of a shelter, never solid, always broken in places, so the wind lost its temper before it found the fire inside. Weave it the same way, let it breathe, or it'll only build a drift where you don't want one. Caleb and Micah were driving another post into the frozen ground when a horse pulled up at the fence line. Garrett Coe climbed down without a greeting for anyone. He was the largest ranch owner in the Chiricahua Basin and Etenia's rival for longer than either of them cared to bring up out loud. Years back, after Talco died, Garrett had once tried to buy Antelope Wash for a price Etenia turned down flat, and he'd talked about the ranch's failure as inevitable ever since. He looked over the half-built frame and smiled. So this is Whitfield's willow wall. His boot nudged one of the posts. All that'll do is catch snow and bury your own barn for you. Caleb rested both hands on the post driver. If I set it too close, you'd be right. Distance matters more than height. Garrett's smile thinned. He turned toward Etenia instead. Since when does a drifter get to play engineer on your land? He's not a drifter. Etenia never looked up from the survey stake. He's my foreman until the work proves otherwise. The words caught Caleb off guard as much as they did Garrett. Garrett let out a short laugh. You'll still need my freight road once the passes close. He gathered his reins. Put it in writing if you want to talk business. He rode off without another word, and Micah watched until the horse disappeared over the rise. What if he's right? Caleb picked up the next willow pole. Then we change it before the snow does. The first hard squall came sooner than anyone had planned for. Before the wind reached the ranch, Caleb tied narrow strips of cloth to the willow posts, wanting to see how the air actually moved instead of guessing at it from the ground. The answer came within minutes. The center of the wall was woven too tight. Wind climbed straight up and over it, rolled down the far side and slammed into the ground behind the wall instead of past it. Thin snow and dry grass started drifting toward the barn door. One panel of woven willow tore loose entirely. An old milk cow balked at the narrow passage and nearly wrenched the gate off its hinge. Across the basin, two of Garrett's hands stopped their wagon just long enough to watch it happen. Caleb didn't defend the mistake. He cut away nearly a fifth of the willow from the center panel. Etenia studied the fluttering cloth strips a moment. Weave the next section on the diagonal instead of flat. Let the wind spread out through it instead of fighting one solid face. They worked until the light gave out. When the next gust hit, it passed through the willow, lost its force, and never reached the barn at all. Caleb nodded toward the cloth, still dancing on its string. A wall that stops everything just becomes a different kind of cliff. It only needs to take the strength out of the wind, not stop it dead. The offset entrance showed them another flaw. That same evening, the turn into the barn was too sharp, and the old cow refused to walk into the dark corner it created. Etenia measured the gap with her eyes. We widen it. They moved the gate, opened the angle, and hung a lantern where the shadows had been spooking the cattle. As the light went, Etenia handed Caleb the willow cutters. Your wall. She glanced at the cloth strip still moving in the wind. My wind. A small smile crossed her face, just enough that he noticed it. We'll fix them both. A week later, Thomas Rourke, the county livestock inspector, rode out to Antelope Wash after hearing that Etenia was rebuilding her barn ahead of winter instead of waiting for trouble to find her. He didn't laugh at any of it. He put hard questions to Caleb instead. A tighter barn traps moisture. Deep bedding builds up ammonia if it isn't turned. A raised crib can heat itself from the inside if the air can't move through it. A homemade water line can pull dirt right back into the trough. That canvas curtain's only safe if it stays clear of the stovepipe. Caleb met every one without arguing. Together, he and Rourke checked the rid vent, tested the bedding by hand, measured the warmth building inside the hay, and checked the distance between the canvas and the stove. Before he left, Rourke made one request. Keep records. 3 weeks, Minimum. Morning and evening temperatures. Firewood used, hay fed. How wet the bedding runs. Every time you have to break ice on that trough. Etenia hung a ledger on a nail beside the kitchen door. Rourke pointed toward where the pipe crossed through the wall on its way to the trough. That section right there could turn into a coal bridge on you. Caleb nodded. I'll box it in dry wool and wood before the first real freeze. I've got no proof yet that any of this will hold up. You shouldn't have any, Caleb allowed, without any offense in his voice. He looked out over the half-finished ranch. Not until it does. Etenia handed a pencil to Micah. Write down today's numbers. The boy marked the first line into the ledger, carefully, like it mattered more than anything he'd written before. Within a week, the numbers had a shape of their own on the page. Columns straightening, his figures growing smaller and steadier the more mornings he practiced them. From that morning forward, the facts would carry more weight than anyone's opinion. But before the numbers could prove a single thing, the cold ran its own plain and practical test first. The first batch of chinking failed. Caleb had mixed too much clay into the mortar, and after 2 cold nights, the fresh seams pulled away from the logs and left thin cracks a strip of wool would still flutter through. He reached for the scraper without complaint. We started over. Etenia stopped him before he began. My father used to seal winter shelters the old way. Talico learned it from him after we married. Less clay, more animal hair, more rye straw worked through it. You scratch the first layer rough before you finish the second over it. So the 2 grip. Instead of sliding apart, they mixed a new batch together, and this time it held to the logs instead of pulling loose. Later, while searching the storage loft for more chinking rags, Caleb found an old canvas roll with the stitching still tight along its edges. Sarah made this, he offered quietly. We used it as a draft curtain back at a freight camp before Micah was even born. He started measuring where to cut it. You don't have to use it. I want to. Together they hung the whole canvas between the sleeping room and the main room without cutting a single stitch out of it. While they worked, Caleb described Sarah for the first time since arriving. She never feared the cold a day in her life, but she'd check a child's wrist for warmth before she ever checked the fire. She could sew a tighter seam than most men could build with lumber and nails. Etenia's mouth curved, just slightly. Palico used to set 2 tin cups by the stove every morning, whether anyone was there to drink from them or not. A house should always look ready for company, he thought, even in a bad winter. The next morning, 2 cups sat by the stove again. Neither of them mentioned why. That evening the room held its warmth far longer than it ever had before. Caleb rested his hand against Sarah's old stitching for a moment, then let it go. The canvas stayed exactly where it belonged. The rhythm of the ranch began to settle into something steadier. While Caleb worked outside with both hands, Etenia cared for Wren without any ceremony about it, warming milk, changing blankets, walking slow circles by the stove whenever the baby grew restless. Before long she could tell a cry for warmth apart from a cry for food just by the pitch of it. At first she held the baby too stiffly, the way anyone holds what isn't theirs to hold. Then something in her eased. Wren stopped crying the moment she heard Etenia's boots crossing the floor. Small fingers reached for the collar of her coat without being asked. More than once, Caleb came inside and found them standing exactly that way. Wren asleep against her shoulder, a pencil still in Etenia's free hand from recording hay and firewood into the ledger. He reached for the baby once. Etenia gave the smallest shake of her head. She only just fell asleep. Caleb laid his dry gloves down by the stove instead, where she could warm her hands with them later, and went back out to check the trough. Another afternoon, Micah sat beside her shelling dry beans into a wooden bowl. After a long quiet, he looked up. "Why don't you have children?" Etenia kept her eyes on her hands. "Some rooms get built and never get filled." Micah glanced toward the cradle where Wren was sleeping. "That one's filled now." She had no answer ready for that, but the next morning, Caleb noticed something he'd been hoping to see for weeks. The leftover cornbread sat untouched on the table where Micah had left it. For the first time since Sarah died, his son had gone to sleep believing there would still be food there tomorrow. Before this storm hits full force, if you want more stories like Etenia and Caleb's, become a channel member and tap join beside the channel name. It really does help. The first real cold snap came before anyone expected it. By sunrise, the temperature had dropped to 10 above zero, the first honest test of everything they'd built. The old barn had once struggled to hold above 18 degrees, with cold drafts crossing the floor all day long. Now behind the willow wall and the offset entrance, the milk barn held steady between 31 and 34 whenever the inner door stayed shut. The house burned 4 armloads of firewood instead of 6. The bedding stayed dry. The ground beneath the raised crib smelled clean instead of sour. Then the water stopped. The buried line stayed open, but the metal coupling out by the trough had frozen solid. Rourke had been right about that stretch. Where the pipe crossed into open air, it had turned into exactly the cold bridge he'd warned them about. Caleb grabbed an axe and broke the ice away by hand. I missed it. There was no excuse hiding anywhere in his voice. Together, he and Etenia lowered the drain valve, built a small wooden box around the coupling, packed it with dry wool waste, wrapped tarred cloth over the outside, and left just enough airspace to keep moisture from collecting inside it. They worked until nearly midnight. Etenia came out carrying 2 tin cups of hot chicory coffee. Caleb took one without lifting his eyes from the coupling. I said I'd fix this ranch. You did. The water still froze. She blew across the steam before she drank. You promised to fix it. You never promised to guess right the first time. The words stayed with him longer than the coffee did. The next morning they filled the trough again, and the water ran clean and drained itself out exactly the way it was supposed to. For the first time, Caleb understood something that had nothing to do with pipes at all. Etenia wasn't measuring him by whether he ever failed. She was measuring him by whether he stayed until the failure was gone. For 3 weeks the ledger filled, one careful line at a time. Every morning Micah wrote down the temperature. Etenia added the firewood tally, the hay fed, the milk collected, how damp the bedding ran, and every time the trough needed breaking. Slowly, the numbers built their own argument. Nearly 2 fewer armloads of wood burned on the coldest days. Hay use dropped almost 20%. Milk held steady. Since the water line had been repaired, the trough hadn't frozen once. Rourke came back and read every page before he closed the book. I wouldn't call it proven, but it's doing exactly what it ought to be doing. That same afternoon, Garrett Coe rode in. Once the snow comes, my freight road closes, unless you sign your spring water rights over to my herd. No, Garrett shrugged. A few cold nights aren't winter yet. Caleb held his tongue until Garrett had ridden off. Then he had one question. How many days of hay if his road stays closed on us? 17 by the old numbers. Longer if the ledger's telling the truth. Caleb studied the gray line of sky sitting over the ridge. We prepare for 24 without another word. Etenia opened the ledger, wrote 24 beneath the last entry, and drew one clean line under it. From that moment forward, the ranch stopped preparing for the winter they hoped would come easy, and started preparing for the one that wouldn't. The sky began to change, 3 days before the storm reached them. At midday, Sable turned her back to the northwest wind and refused to graze. The air went heavy and still. Low gray clouds stretched across the whole basin in long, unbroken bands. Just before sunset, the wind died out completely, and the birds went quiet. And somewhere in that silence, Caleb and Etenia stopped talking about improvements and started talking about survival instead. Marker posts went into the frozen ground every 20 feet, strips of pale cloth tied to each one, so a man could find them by touch if the snow took his eyes from him. The cistern was filled to the top. Hay was pulled in closer to the barn without closing off the air channels running through it. Every rope on the windbreak was checked twice. The milk cows and the young calves were moved into the sheltered section behind the wall. Extra lanterns were hung inside the offset entrance. A guide rope was strung from the house to the barn door. A repair bag sat waiting by the threshold. Michael watched the last marker post disappear into the ground. "Why do we need the rope and the posts both?" Caleb tied off another knot. "A rope keeps a man from drifting off course. Posts show him whether he's still going somewhere." While searching the shed, Etenia found an old stake carved with Talico's mark, and she carried it out to the position closest to the house herself. Caleb reinforced the repair bag with a leather strap Sarah had sewn years back. Nothing useful got left behind. That evening Nettie Voss stopped on her way south to stay with kin until the storm passed. She left fresh goat's milk on the table, and her eyes caught the 2 tin cups sitting by the stove, though she kept whatever she thought about that to herself. Near dusk, a written warning arrived from Rourke. An Arctic front was pushing down out of the north. Winds could top 65 miles an hour. Once the snow started, no one was to leave shelter for any reason. Everything that could be made ready had been made ready. Now the ranch would wait on the only judge whose verdict actually counted. The Whitehorn arrived before dawn, announcing itself first as a low roar out past the ridge, then as a wall of white that swallowed the fence line, the creek, and finally the barn roof itself, until the whole ranch seemed to shrink down to the small circle of lantern light inside the house. The first blast came out of the northwest exactly as Caleb had predicted it would. The willow wall bent hard and held. Snow piled up right where it was supposed to, well, clear of the barn doors. The offset entrance broke the worst of the wind before it ever reached the cattle inside. The cistern stayed open under its cover. The trough filled, then drained itself before the pipe had any chance to freeze. Behind Sarah's canvas curtain, the children's sleeping room held its warmth through the worst of it. Caleb and Etenia crossed between house and barn one at a time, clipped fast to the guide rope, never both outside at once. By midday, one marker post had already vanished under drifting snow. The next one still showed its strip of fluttering cloth above the white. Late that afternoon, a dull, steady pounding sounded beyond the windbreak. Caleb followed the line of posts out into the whiteout and found Jed Colby half buried beside the next marker, his horse long gone, his cheeks already going white with frostbite. He'd lost the rest of Garrett's crew hours earlier trying to find their way home. "I saw the cloth," Jed managed. "That's why I kept walking." Caleb brought him inside without another word passing between them. When Jed came around beside the stove, his breathing came in short, slow pulls. Garrett's north barn. Winds blowing straight through it. Cattle are packed into one corner, still trying to reach water they can't get to. Nobody had anything to say to that. Jed's eyes went to the canvas hanging between the rooms. Only days before he'd laughed at Whitfield's willow wall from the saddle of his own horse. Now that same wall had carried him home alive. The storm tightened its grip through the night. The cold dropped even lower. Before sunrise, Clover, the oldest milk cow on the place, went into labor weeks earlier than anyone had counted on. One look was all Etenia needed to know something was badly wrong. A calf had turned. Dr. Amos Reyes, the country veterinarian who rode a circuit across the whole basin, had no way to reach them. Every road for miles sat buried under drift. There would be no help beyond whoever was already standing inside that barn. While Caleb checked the water line and the windbreak lashings one more time, Etenia washed her hands in warm water, tied Clover's tail back out of the way, found the calf's front legs by feel, and worked slowly with the boiled calving straps the way Dr. Reyes had shown her years before, back when Talico was still alive to hold the lantern for her, back when she'd first learned that a steady hand mattered more than a strong one. Micah held the light this time. His hand shook. "Watch her eyes." Etenia kept her own voice quiet and even. He obeyed. Caleb came back in just as the final pull was needed. The calf slid out onto the dry straw and didn't breathe. Etenia cleared its mouth with 2 fingers. Caleb rubbed hard at its ribs with a fistful of clean straw. Without being asked, Micah pressed a dry towel into Etenia's free hand. For one long moment, nothing happened at all. The wind screamed against the barn boards, and nobody in that stall dared to breathe either. The seconds stretched long enough that Micah's lantern hand began to shake worse than before, and Etenia laid her palm flat against the calf's ribs, waiting, the way she'd once waited beside Talico over a different animal in a different winter. Then the calf drew its first breath, and everyone in that barn went completely still. From the house, Wren started to cry. Still weak from the cold, Jed pulled the old cradle closer to the stove and warmed another bottle of milk on his own, no one having to ask him twice. Nobody stood outside the work anymore, not that night. The dry bedding kept the newborn calf off a frozen floor. The offset entrance held the wind out of the calving stall. Running water made clean hands possible in the middle of a blizzard. The lantern in the widened passage kept the herd calm enough not to trample anything. Micah finally let go of the breath he'd been holding since the calf first hit the straw. The third day brought the worst wind of the whole storm. Just past noon, one of the lashings on the north section of the windbreak gave way, torn clean through at the knot. The woven panel shook hard against its frame. If it failed completely, the wind would pour straight through the offset passage and start burying the barn door from the inside. Within hours, the cattle could be sealed in with no way for anyone to reach them. Caleb reached for the rope. Etenia caught the other end without a single word passing between them. Outside, the storm erased everything past the next marker post. Caleb crawled from stake to stake on his hands and knees, the wind flattening him twice before he'd gone 10 feet. One post had already broken off at the base. The loose willow lattice slammed into him and knocked him flat into a drift. His repair bag burst open and tools scattered across the snow, and only Sarah's old leather strap kept the bag itself from blowing off into the dark. Inside the barn, Clover bellowed. From the house, Wren's crying carried loud enough over the wind to reach him even out there. Etenia held the rope in both fists, her arms burning from the strain of it. Then she felt 3 sharp tugs, their signal, give line. She fed more rope out into the storm, hand over hand, refusing to let herself think past the next foot of it. Caleb reached the broken section and braced it with a spare willow pole set across the frame, instead of trying to rebuild the whole wall from scratch. It didn't need to hold forever, only until morning. The rope finally went, still in her hands. Etenia pulled. A figure crawled out of the white on one arm and one knee, and she hauled him the last few feet by the collar of his coat. Caleb pushed himself upright, breathing hard. It'll hold until morning. Etenia looked past him at the storm still tearing across the basin. Morning's enough. By the 4th morning, the wind had finally started to weaken. Nobody celebrated. They just started counting instead. Every last animal was still alive. The newborn calf carried only a small patch of frostbite on one ear. The bedding was still dry. Water still ran through the trough. The hay crib showed no heat and no rot. The barn doors opened without anyone having to dig through snow first. There was still firewood stacked by the stove. Jed Colby stood up on his own 2 feet again. Caleb walked the ranch that morning with a notebook instead of any sense of relief. One brace had been too light. 2 marker posts needed to sit deeper in the ground. The cloth strips would need stronger stitching next time. The wooden cover over the water coupling needed a better roof on it. Etenia watched him writing it all down. You've counted every weakness before you've counted what survived. Caleb closed the notebook. The living can wait an hour. He looked out over the battered windbreak. A weakness that hides behind one good outcome finds you again eventually. Later, the clouds broke, just enough to show a strip of gray sky. Steam rose off the cattle as they blew warm air into the freezing morning. The children have their milk. Caleb studied the broken section of willow wall. The ranch still needs fixing. Neither of them brought up spring. Neither of them brought up leaving. That evening, Etenia set his dry gloves down beside the 2 tin cups waiting near the stove, as naturally as if they'd always belonged there. When the roads finally opened, people came to Antelope Wash looking for answers instead of rumors. Rourke arrived first, Dr. Reyes followed. Then came neighboring ranchers, who'd spent 4 days digging their own cattle out of drifts by hand. Rourke inspected everything without any hurry to it. He checked the barn temperature, felt the bedding with his bare hand, examined the water system, counted the surviving herd, measured the hay left standing, and read every page of the ledger from the first entry 3 weeks before the storm to the last line written during it. At last he closed the book. The barn stayed drier than any I've inspected in this basin. The herd burned less feed than I'd have guessed. Steady water made the real difference here. That windbreak stood exactly where the snow wanted to settle instead of where your doors needed to open. And every flaw you two found early got fixed before the blizzard ever showed up to test it. He tucked the ledger under his arm like a man closing out a court record, and told them plainly he'd be recommending the same 3 weeks of numbers to every rancher who came asking him for advice from here on. Jed had his own 2 cents to add. I'd be dead in that snow if those marker posts weren't standing. Garrett Coe came last. His own ranch had lost cattle. Part of his north barn roof had torn clean away in the wind. He gave no apology for any of it. Instead, he looked out at the willow wall a long moment. How far'd you set it from the barn? 34 feet, through the middle. Then we adjusted a little for the ground under it. And you never weave it tight enough to stop the wind dead. It just needs to lose its strength. Garrett nodded once. Show me. Caleb walked beside him out across the snow without another word passing between them, and within the month, ranches all through the Chiricahua Basin, Garrett's included, had adopted some version of the same winter plan. Later, after everyone else had gone, Etenia led Caleb into the ranch office and laid a folded paper on the desk. It granted him a share of the ranch's earnings, authority over the water systems, the structural work, and every winter preparation going forward. One line stood apart from the rest, set off on its own. Micah and Wren would always have a home at Antelope Wash, no matter what happened or didn't happen, between the 2 adults signing their names to it. Caleb looked up from the page. Why give me part of something that's always been yours? Etenia met his eyes without any hesitation in it. I'm not giving you what was mine. She turned the paper toward him. I'm naming what you already carried onto this land. That evening, after the paper was signed, they sat by the stove while the ranch settled into its first quiet night since the storm broke. The fire burned low between them. Neither one hurried to fill the silence. Caleb looked into his cup. I came here asking for milk. I never meant to owe you a life. Etenia wrapped both hands around her coffee. You don't owe me one. She glanced up. But there's one here, if you mean to share it. Caleb smiled for the first time in months. I'll stay until the snow's gone. Etenia looked toward the window where ice still clung to the fence rails. Stay until the grass comes back. He lifted his eyes to hers. Longer than that. They didn't marry the moment the roads reopened. The work came first, the way it always had between them. In the weeks that followed, they rebuilt the damaged section of the windbreak together, and under Caleb's guidance, ranches across the basin, Garrett's included, folded their own version of the Antelope Wash winter plan into their own barns and fence lines. If Etenia and Caleb's ranch is the kind of story that stays with you, become a channel member and tap join beside the channel name. It helps these stories keep coming. It wasn't until early May that Caleb and Etenia held a quiet wedding, witnessed only by Dr. Reyes and Inspector Rourke. The whole celebration lasted just long enough to sign the papers, because Clover had gone into labor again that same afternoon, and someone needed to be there for it. Garrett never came himself, but a neat bundle of straight willow stakes left leaning against the fence a few days later stood in as a silent kind of blessing from a man who still wasn't much for words of his own. A few days after the wedding, Micah looked up from the ledger where he was marking the morning temperature. "Do I have to call you something else now?" "You never have to call me anything you don't mean." Micah gave one firm nod. Etenia. For a while, that was enough for both of them. But weeks later, tripping near the marker posts, still standing out past the barn, he blurted, "Ma, Etenia," before catching himself halfway through it. She rushed over to brush the dirt off his hands and let the half-finished word pass without ever once letting on that she'd heard it. Spring came back slowly to the Chiricahua Basin. The last hard drifts thinned along the fence line. The creek ran loud and full for the first time in months, and the willow wall Caleb had once staked out in the frozen dark stood green and budding at the base, the way Etenia had promised him a windbreak should half alive, even in the worst of any season. Antelope Wash looked for the first time since Talico's death like a ranch, built for the years ahead of it, instead of just the winter in front of it. Beside the barn post where Micah had just carved a fresh line marking the year's first snowmelt, the same patient way Etenia had once shown him her own father marked the turning seasons on a lodgepole back home, little Wren took careful, unsteady steps toward Etenia across the yard. "Ma!" The small voice carried clean across the open ground. Etenia didn't rush to meet her. She knelt down where she stood and waited, patient, while the girl finished the last few steps entirely on her own. Caleb's eyes moved over the repaired windbreak, the open barn doors, the cattle out grazing loose across the flat. "It still needs fixing. That's a good thing." Etenia handed him the second tin cup. "You promised you'd stay as long as there was work. Antelope Wash didn't survive that winter because the cold showed any mercy. It showed none at all. It survived because every weakness in it got found and fixed before the storm ever arrived to test it. Caleb and Etenia never rescued each other. Not really. They simply stopped mistaking their own loneliness for strength. And out here, on the edge of the Chiricahua Basin, that's a lesson that outlasts any winter that comes to test it.